In this video, we're going to cover PlayStation Emulation on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. The PS1, my favorite Sony system. Also a very good one to emulate. PlayStation Emulation lets you do a lot of cool things that the original system just wasn't capable of, and as a result, you can really make the experience something far different than the original was. PlayStation Emulation is a bit more involved to get set up with required BIOS files and the way games can be stored, so let's go ahead and dive in. Now, as you get started on your PlayStation Emulation journey, remember that this guide is a continuation of my Retroarch and Dev Mode setup guide, so if you don't have Dev Mode and Retroarch already installed, link to this guide will be in the description below for you to get it set up and ready to go so you can follow along with this tutorial. And if you're interested in tutorials for other systems, I have a metric crap ton on my channel for various systems that you might be interested in. So, link to this playlist will also be in the description below. Now, as previously stated, PlayStation Emulation does require the use of a PlayStation BIOS. So if you do have an original PlayStation and would like to dump the BIOS from it, I have a guide on how to do so here. It's an oldie but a goodie. Or if you happen to have a PlayStation Classic that you have hacked, that is the easiest way to grab a PlayStation BIOS in my opinion. But if you don't have any PlayStation systems to dump BIOS files from, that's okay. There is a relatively new method on how to extract the emulated PS1 BIOS from the PS3 firmware. And so I also have a guide for that one as well, so links to these will be in the description below. Otherwise, you can resort to Google and find things that way, but as always, illegal download links are not provided on my channel, so please don't ask. But once you have your BIOS files sourced, depending on where you gather them from, Japanese BIOS files need to be named scph5500.bin, US BIOS files need to be named scph5501.bin, and European BIOS files need to be named scph5502.bin. So these three are the ones I dumped from my PS Classic, and are the ones that I will mainly be using in my emulation projects. Now for today's demo purposes, I did also grab the ps1_rom.bin file from the PlayStation 3 firmware, so it is ready to go as well. So to get all of these up and running for your PlayStation emulation on Xbox Series X and S, get your Xbox USB emulation drive plugged into your computer, open up your Retroarch folder, go to your system folder, and then drag those BIOS files right on in. And they are now good to go. Now the next thing we need are PlayStation games. If you happen to have a large physical collection of PS1 games, you can actually use the PC version of Retroarch to easily dump those for your emulation projects. So, video tutorial on that one also on the channel. Otherwise, again, you can resort to the Googles, but no illegal download links are provided on this channel once again. Now for PS1 games, you either want them in BinQ format or CHUD format. So CHUD is a compressed format, whereas BinQ is just their standard image files. Either one works, but for today's demo, my games are already in CHUD format. But we do have a little bit of extra setup required for using multi-disc games. So, in a multi-disc game, you will need to create an M3U file for Retroarch to easily be able to swap between the game's discs. So the process for this is really simple. Just create a text file. Name it after the game in question. And put a region code in there as well if you want to be able to easily find cover art for it later. But once the text file is created, just go ahead and open it up. And now we're going to add in the name of our games. So there's two methods of doing this. If you have your games in BinQ format, you're going to copy the entire name and extension of the Q file into the text document. If you're using CHUD like I am, you're just going to grab the entire file name with the extension. And you're just going to put one disc per line. Just like so. And if you can't see the file extensions, if you're on Windows, you can click on View, Show, and then make sure File Extensions is checked. But once you have all the discs inserted into the text document, just go ahead and save it. And now we're going to rename the extension from .txt to M3U. And if it gets angry at you, that's okay. Just hit yes. And there we go. That game is now ready to go. Once you have all of your PlayStation games ready to go, just load them up onto your Xbox's USB drive. So we're just going to back out of our Retroarch system folder here real quick. And dump these into the games folder. And there we go. And with everything in place, we can now move over to the Xbox, get it booted up into dev mode, and load it into Retroarch. And with RetroArch loaded, we are going to download our PlayStation 1 Emulation Cores. So from the main menu, head to Online Updater, Core Downloader, and then just press right on your D-pad to scroll down to Sony. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on Beetle PSX and SwanStation. Once you have those cores downloaded, you can go ahead and back out to the main menu. And from here, you have two methods of loading up your PS1 games. So the first method is to go to Load Content, navigate to your E drive, Games folder, find your PlayStation Games folder, select a game, select a core, and it should run. You might have to set up a BIOS file setting if you're using the PS3 BIOS file, but we'll go over that more in a minute. Now, I don't really care for that method, so what I like to do instead is create a games playlist by going down to Import Content and doing a manual scan. For the content directory, navigate to your E drive, Games folder, find your PlayStation games, tell it to scan this directory. System name, press right on your D-pad to go down to Sony and find PlayStation. If you want to set up a default core between Beetle PSX or SwanStation, you can do so here as well. Otherwise, you can leave it unspecified so you can choose which core you want to use. Now, under File Extensions, if you're using BinQ format disks, I'd recommend coming in here and setting up a CUEQ file extension so that way it doesn't pick up all the individual bin files. Otherwise, you're going to have multiple entries on your playlists. If you have multi-disc games in subfolders, go ahead and turn Scan Recursively off for this first scan. And then just go ahead and start the scan. Now, go ahead and turn Scan Recursively back on. And under File Extensions, set an extension for M3U, so that way only the M3U file for your multi-disc games will be detected. And then go ahead and start the scan again. And once completed, you will now have a PlayStation games list with all of your games inside of it. So here we go, multi-disc games, Chrono Cross, Command & Conquer: Red Alert, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear, all detected as single entries with the M3U extension set. And from here, you can begin playing games just by selecting the game and telling it to run, and then choosing your preferred core. So for this tutorial, we are going to start with Beetle PSX. So if you are using BIOS files dumped from an original PlayStation or the PlayStation Classic, things should just pop up automatically for you and be ready to go. If you are using that emulated PlayStation 3 BIOS, you might get an error about the firmware being missing. If that happens, just go into your RetroArch quick menu, navigate to Core Options, navigate down to Emulation Hacks, and activate the Override BIOS file. And then you can choose the PS3, PS1 BIOS file to be used. And then when you restart the content, it'll boot right up. But Beetle PSX is a very accurate PS1 emulator. It's probably my favorite PS1 emulator at this current time. Unfortunately for Xbox Series X and S, we can't use the hardware version of the core because it uses OpenGL to do its video rendering for upscaling, which is not supported by default on Xbox, and there is no Angle version of the core available to give us proper upscaling with this core. Hardware-backed upscaling, I should say, because you can still do software upscaling, but you aren't able to push it as high as SwanStation. But let's go ahead and cover the options available to us within Beetle PSX. So going into our RetroArch quick menu and going to Core Options. So in our first tab, we have our video options, and our first set of options to change are the internal GPU resolution. So since we are limited to software rendering, you aren't going to be able to push this very high, so 2 and 4x are going to be about it, and 4x can lag in a number of games. So if you start experiencing lag, just drop it back down and see what happens. But as you can see, it does give you a nice increase in overall emulation quality. So again, here was that 1x for you. And we're going to go for 2x on my tutorial today. So there we go. There's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 running at 2 times internal resolution on Beetle PSX. Now our next option is to change the dithering pattern. So the PS1 system had a system-wide dithering pattern, if I remember correctly. And this lets you change how it is emulated, so it's on 1x native by default. And that is why you can see that there is just a bunch of dithering artifacts across the screen. If desired, you could turn this over to the internal resolution to make the dots smaller, or you could disable it completely. Just note that without dithering, you are going to see a lot more color banding, artifacts, and things like that. So personal preference, I like to just set this one over to the internal resolution option myself. Next up, frame duping. I like to turn this one on. And our next option, PAL European Video Timing Override. For our European friends with PAL-based games, this will help you get faster frame rates out of them. It tries to override the 50 Hz to 60 Hz, so if you're in PAL mode, you can try these out, see if it helps you get better performance out of your emulated titles. Next up, crop overscan. This will remove unused space around the border of your PlayStation games, also hides garbage data, and it is set to dynamic by default, and that is a really good option to leave it on. You can mess around with static and none. Next, additional cropping. So if you want to crop even more pixels around your screen, you could do so here to help remove further garbage data. And then you could also offset the cropped image to the left and right with this next option. Next up, GPU rasterizer overclock. This is a system overclock for your emulated PS1. Really doesn't do very much, but you can crank it up, see if it helps out any performance issues it might come across, but for this one, it's really not useful. There's better ways of overclocking your emulated CPU in the PS1, so we'll go over those in a second. Next up, core aspect ratio. So this is where you could set your preferred aspect ratio. So there's corrected, which is the default one. Uncorrected. Force 4:3. And force NTSC. So being a 4:3 guy, I really like to force everything into 4:3. So personal preference on this one, whether you prefer a more square pixel look or a stretched out look. And then our last two options are for scan line effects. I don't use these personally, so you can mess around with them, see what you like, but it will adjust the way that your image displays on your screen. All right, backing out. On-screen display. So our only option within this menu is to display the internal FPS our games are running at. So as you can see, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 for PS1 here does not run at a locked 60 FPS and can vary wildly between 60 to 30-ish. So it's really dependent on what is happening in the game at the time. All right, backing out, input. So input options on PS1 emulation are very important, because the PlayStation started with a digital-only controller and introduced the DualShock later in its life. Every game is designed to support the digital controller, and that is its default input. But as you know, playing some games with a digital-only input really sucks. So we're actually going to back out of the input menu here, back out of the core options, head down to controls, and under our port 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 controls, you can actually change the device type that you are emulating. So again, by default, you are emulating the digital-only PlayStation controller. By going into this menu, you can also emulate the DualShock, the analog controller, the analog joystick, gun cons, justifiers, mouse, and NegCon. Fortunately, some of these options aren't going to work for us on Xbox, like the mouse, but you can change between the input options here, so we're going to go ahead and select the DualShock. Now, the DualShock is not supported in all titles, which is why the PlayStation controller is the one that's selected. So if desired, you can go into each of your PlayStation games and manage your remap file and save the game remap file per game, depending on the controller type you want to use. But going back into our core options, input options, our first option is analog self-calibration, and I recommend turning this one on so you can get the best performance out of your sticks while playing PlayStation DualShock titles. Now the next option is to enable the DualShock analog mode toggle. So this is an option that will let you easily turn the sticks on and off if you just want to have a default DualShock setup. So with this option on, and combined with the next option of DualShock analog mode combo, you can easily turn the sticks on and off. So going back into Tony Hawk 3 here, I cannot control the game with the analog sticks right now. I have to use the D-pad because the sticks are still turned off. So by pressing L1, R1, and select, my sticks are now on, and I can control the game with my left thumbstick. Very cool. And again, you can turn them off just as easily by pressing L1, R1, and select. And now I can no longer control the game with the analog stick. So if you only want to have DualShock set as your default controller, these are the perfect options to have enabled, so that way you can easily toggle between modes just like on a real PlayStation console. You could also set the analog mode combo delay, just in case you have games that would be conflicted with this specific button mapping, but I mean there are a bunch of different combos you could choose. Now our next two options are to enable multi-tap on either port 1 or port 2, so if you're playing games that can support the multi-tap, these are the options for you to enable. Now we're going to have to skip over the light gun stuff because it doesn't work on Xbox Series X and S at this time, as well as the mouse sensitivity stuff. And that brings us to the NegCon twist response. On Xbox, it is recommended to change this option over to quadratic if you want to emulate the NegCon twist. And then you could also implement a dead zone if your controller is a bit drifty. Otherwise, leave it at 0. Alright, backing out, next up, memory card. So the first option is to choose our memory card and port 1's save method, and this is on libretro by default. If you plan to share your saves between a PC running the standalone version of Mednafen, you could also change this over to the Mednafen method, so that way it's easier to share the saves. But at the same time, all you have to do is rename the extension to share them anyway, so it doesn't really matter a whole lot. And our next option is to enable memory card in slot 2. This is a good option to have set if you want to share saves for games like Metal Gear Solid to get the Psycho Mantis cutscene to talk about your saves in your memory card. But some games don't work with it on, so you will need to have them disabled for those specific titles. Our next option is to enable shared memory cards. So I recommend leaving this one off, otherwise you're going to run out of save space really quick and have to manage your memory cards like on a real console. With it off, each game gets its own memory card, and you really don't have to worry about running out of space, which is really nice. And again, if you want to have shared saves, you can copy things over to the memory card in port 2. And now our last two options are to cycle between different memory cards if you have the memory card 0 method set to Mednafen. Otherwise, just leave this one on 0, but if you have shared memory cards enabled, you can change between different memory cards here. Alright, backing out. PGXP. So this is to fix the wobbly rendering found in PS1 games. So just to give a quick demo here, look at Tony Hawk 3 again. You can see how the ground kind of shakes and shifts as you look around. By turning on PGXP, and I recommend doing memory only, you can see that it is now a little less wobbly. Not 100% perfect, mind you, but it is a lot better to look at compared to just the irregular shakiness. Now you can improve the effect by enabling the PGXP 2D geometry tolerances and enabling primitive culling. And the strength of these effects are going to be dependent on the game. Some look better with it on than others, but it is still a really cool option to mess with. Do note that PGXP can cause bugs and errors in some games, so do use it with caution. But backing out, next up we have emulation hacks. And our first option in this menu is for line to quad hack. So this is set to default by default, and that's where you're going to leave it for most games. But games like Doom, Dark Forces, Duke Nukem, Hexen, Soul Blade all require this to be set to aggressive. So for the overwhelming majority of games, it's fine to leave this one on default, but do note that you will need to change it over to aggressive for those few specific titles listed in the text here for the option. Next up, widescreen mode hacks. So this will force your games to run in a widescreen format, but it isn't always perfect. It really is dependent on the games. But as you can see, it does try to render at a proper 16:9 ratio, but you may experience object culling at the 4:3 borders. As you can see with the S here in Tony Hawk, you can see that it just kind of disappears before it actually goes off screen, because that's the way the engine runs. And you can adjust the aspect ratio of your widescreen hack to various settings, so 16:10, 21:9 if you have an ultra-wide monitor. So the effect can be really cool, but again, it can cause a lot of issues in rendering without proper widescreen patches. So here we go, 32:9 is just pushing the engine for Tony Hawk 3 here. So personal preference if you want to use it or not. But next up we have our CPU frequency scaling. So this is our CPU overclock for PS1 games. And this is how you're going to increase your frame rate in unstable games like Tony Hawk 3 for my example. So if we crank this up to 200%, you can see we now have a locked 60 FPS gameplay experience. Well, 59.83, whatever. But as you can see, it is no longer a fluctuating frame rate. And it is going to be very CPU heavy depending on the effects and settings that you have enabled, such as PGXP. But you could get some pretty awesome results out of it. And our next option is for GTE overclock. This basically reduces the latency of emulated GTE operations, so that way you just get better frame rates and frame time. So it's another good one to have enabled if you plan on doing the overclock options. Our next option is to skip the BIOS intro. So if you have your BIOS files and you don't like that it plays the intro every single time, you could turn this option on to skip over it. But do note, for PAL users, it can cause problems with copy protected games. So it's recommended to leave this option off. Next, override BIOS. We already covered this one at the start of our emulation. And for our last two options, I just recommend leaving them at their defaults unless you are very familiar with the different timer event cycles. I mean, you can experiment with it if you want, but leaving it on default is just fine. Alright, backing out. So our next option is for CPU Dynarec. It's set to disabled by default, which uses the Beetle interpreter CPU. So most accurate, but you can also enable these different options to see if you get better performance in some games. But for the most part, it's fine leaving it on disabled. We're going to skip down to core reported FPS timing now, so this is set to progressive rate. And I recommend leaving it there. You can allow interlaced and allow automatic toggling, but it's better just to leave everything on progressive. Next, we have CD access method, and this is set to synchronous by default, and it will read the disk image as it needs to. If you get errors or stutters, you can change this over to asynchronous, or the best option would be to pre-cache the entire disk image into system RAM to prevent any possible performance issues. Does come at the cost of higher startup times as it copies the image over into RAM, but the results are well worth it. And our last option for Beetle PSX is our CD loading speed. This is set to 2x speed by default, but you can crank it all the way up to 14x to increase PS1 loading times. Do know that some games have issues with faster drive speeds, so do be aware of that when messing with this option. And with that, we've now covered all of our core options within Beetle PSX. So if there's options you want to have set for some games but not others, you can head up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file, so that way they only apply to that one specific game and not the core as a whole. And now let's go ahead and cover SwanStation. So from your PS1 playlist, you could select a game, tell it to run, and this time select SwanStation if you plan on using both or one or the other. Now, if you're using the original PlayStation BIOS files dumped from a PS1 or from the PlayStation Classic, games should load right up. But if you are using the region-free BIOS found in the PS3 emulator, you will need to go into your Retroarch quick menu, go to Core Options, head into the console settings, and under NTSCU BIOS, you can change this over to the PS3's PS1 BIOS, which is region-free. And then when you exit out and restart the content, your game should now load. So here we are running PS1 games within SwanStation. And again, SwanStation is another great PS1 emulation core, especially on Xbox, because it allows for hardware-based upscaling, so you can push your up-resing a lot higher than what you can on Beetle PSX. But now let's go ahead and cover some of the advanced core options available to us within SwanStation. So going back into our Retroarch quick menu, core options, our first set of options are in the console settings. So the console region is our first one. This is set to auto detect by default, but you can manually specify a region here if desired. Next, that NTSCU BIOS that we already talked about, so you can change between a real system BIOS, the PlayStation Classic BIOS, or the PSP or PS3 emulated PS1 BIOS. Next, we have fast boot, so if you'd like to skip the BIOS startup screen, you can turn this option on, but it can break those copy protected PAL games, so it's just kind of recommended to leave it off for PAL region games, but you can enable it for NTSC just fine most of the time. Next up, CD-ROM region check, just go ahead and leave this one off. Next, CD-ROM read thread, leave this one on. And our next option is to apply image patches to our games. So if you plan on doing any PPF-based game hacks or patches for PS1 games, it's best to put those games into their own subfolders. And then you can enable this option, and when you load the game, it will automatically apply the PPF patch that it finds within that folder. Next, we have a couple of preload image options to RAM, so this will help increase stability during reads. The first option is best for bin-queue format games, so if your games are in bin-queue format, you can preload the image to RAM. Again, it will make it so startup times are increased, but you don't have to worry about any errors coming from read times. And then the next option is to pre-cache the CHUD images to RAM, and this will be a lot faster for CHUD-based games. It won't have to decompress them, and it works on M3U files, so I like to have this option on. Our next option is to mute CD audio. So if your game is running audio in CDDA and XA format, you could disable that audio source, which usually makes it so background music goes away. Don't really see a need to turn this one off unless you want to do like custom soundtracks or something, but I mean, there you go. And our next two options are related to CD-ROM speeds. So again, the PlayStation used a 2x CD-ROM speed, so you can increase this to get faster load times if desired. And the same thing with the Seek speed-up times. Do be aware that increasing this can break some games, so give it a shot. If it works for your games, great. If not, you'll just need to disable it. And our last option is for the CPU execution mode, and this is set to recompiler by default, and I recommend leaving it there. Backing out, enhancement settings. So our first option is to choose our GPU renderer, and we want to leave this on hardware auto, or you could change it over to Direct3D 11. Either way really works, but I mean, you could just leave it on auto and everything will be just fine. And our next option is to increase our internal resolution. So again, since we have access to a hardware renderer, we can up this to a full 4K with minimal performance penalties to get a really clean PS1 emulation experience. And our next option is to use the software renderer for readbacks. So this basically runs the software renderer in parallel with the hardware renderer to fix effects that might be broken in software. It's a great option to have enabled, but it can cause some performance issues if you're running too high of an internal resolution scale. So you could give it a shot, see what happens. If you start getting a massive amount of slowdown, you could try lowering your internal resolution scale. Otherwise, you might just have to turn it off and deal with broken effects. Next, you can enable multi-sample anti-aliasing. Not really necessary if you're running a higher internal resolution, but the option is there if you would like. Our next option is true color rendering, so this will increase the color resolution, but it will disable dithering and break some games. So personal preference on this one. It can, again, break some games, but it can really increase the color depth in others. Next, scale dithering. I like to leave this one on, but personal preference if you want to have the native resolution PS1 dithering present. So I mean, it kind of has a charm to it, even at higher resolutions, so personal preference once again. Next up, disable interlacing, so this will make all 480i games run in 480p, but not all of them work, but definitely recommended to leave this one on. If you run into a game that doesn't work with it, you can just disable it and save it as a game override. Next up, force NTSC timing, so this is for our PAL friends. If you want to try to force your games to run at 60 Hz, you can enable this option. Might break some of them, so do give it a shot on a per game basis. Next, force 4x3 for 24-bit display. So I like to turn this option on just to make sure cutscenes don't get broken if I start messing around with widescreen hacks and other various settings. Next, chroma smoothing for 24-bit display. I like to leave this option on. I feel like it makes cutscenes look better in most games. Next, texture filtering. This is set to nearest neighbor by default to give the best accurate upscaling look, but you could change between a bunch of different options, so you can blur it a bit with bilinear filtering. Give Jink 2 a try. Or XBR. And so that looks like this. So again, personal preference on which one you prefer. But for me, I like to leave this one just set to nearest neighbor to give an accurate upscaled look for PS1 texture display. Next up, we have our widescreen hack to force our 3D games into a widescreen rendering. And our last set of options within the enhancement settings tab is for PGXP geometry correction to get rid of wobbly and jittery polygons in PS1 emulation. So by enabling this option, you are enabling culling correction and perspective correct textures. And it will look something like this. So as you can see, the image is a lot more stable as you move around it, resulting in a more favorable PS1 experience if you don't like the way that the image would shake. Now you can enable other options within this menu to get better results, such as perspective correct colors on the vertexes. The depth buffer isn't supported by all games, but when it is, it can result in some really awesome geometry correction. Enabling the vertex cache is also pretty good. We're going to go ahead and leave CPU mode off though. And then for added precision, you can turn on preserve projection precision. So again, you could get some really awesome results with this option enabled. Doesn't always work. Again, the results will vary on a game-by-game basis, but as you can see, it just looks a lot cleaner and smoother than with it turned off. But again, it isn't compatible with all games, so do use it on a game-by-game basis and see what you think. So, just another quick demo here of what it looked like when we didn't have it on. You can see how the walls just shake and move around as we walk around the environment, so you can see that it did have an effect in Beast Wars. Alright, backing out, display settings. Our first option is for aspect ratio, so 4:3 is set by default, and that's probably why my widescreen hack didn't work. There we go, so we could set this to 16:9. And let's turn on our widescreen hack. There we go. Yep, there it is. Okay, I just jumped the gun a bit, but again, widescreen hacks can cause image culling at the 4:3 border, so as you can see in Beast Wars, you can see the ground and backgrounds being deloaded. Set your aspect ratio here as desired. I like 4:3. Bam, there we go. Next, we could choose our crop mode for our overscan area, so this will crop all borders, great for PAL games. Can just crop the overscan only area. This may result in black bars around the image of your screen, depends on the game, or you can turn off all cropping of overscan area as desired. Next up, downsampling. So once you up-res your games, you can also downsample them back to a more native resolution, so that way you can have smoother appearances in games but outputting at the original resolution, which is really nice for some shader effects. So as you can see, we're running at a lower resolution, but the models and stuff are far less aliased, which is really cool. So personal preference on if you want to use that one or not. Next, you could turn OSD messages on or off. So I mean, you've seen how it's been telling me to restart for the fallbacks, so if we don't like having those messages, you could turn them off. And then you could set the display active areas and line start offsets here if desired for better screen cropping of your games. Backing out, port settings. So our first option, memory card type 1, just leave this on lib retro. And for memory card type 2, I like to have a card shared between all games. Next up, use single card for playlist. Go ahead and leave this option on, so that way when you're running M3U files, it just uses the card for the M3U file and not for each individual disc. Next up, multi-tap mode. So you could turn on the multi-tap for port 1, port 2, or port 1 and 2 as you see fit here. And then we have our DualShock analog mode combo button selection here. So I'm going to set this one to L1, R1, and select. And then you can turn DualShock rumble on or off here. Now, to enable a DualShock in your emulation, you're going to need to back out of the core options, go down to controls, port 1 through 8 controls, and then you're going to change your device type from digital controller over to analog controller, and that is what will give you access to DualShock support. And then you could just press L1, R1, and select to change between digital and analog modes. So not all games are compatible with the DualShock, which is why the digital controller is set to the default. But with the toggle option, you are able to switch between digital and analog mode to easily get all of your games up and running if you just want to have everything set to the DualShock by default. And the controller is set to map the left analog stick over to the D-pad for digital only games as well, if you prefer that option. That's on by default. But with the controller output set to DualShock, a couple of different controller options will be enabled, such as force analog mode, use that analog stick for D-pad mode, analog access scale, and then vibration bias. Alright, backing out, advanced settings. So our first option, CD-ROM async read ahead, so this will help reduce any hitching in CD access speed for compressed games. Next, you can apply a CPU overclock, so if you want to have variable frame rate games run at a higher frame rate, you can increase this up to 200-400% to get locked 60 FPS gameplay. Apply compatibility settings, leave this one on, it will automatically turn off things that might break some games. Log level, we could just skip over. And that brings us to CPU recompiler iCache, so if you have some games that are running too fast, you can turn this one on to slow them back down to normal. Otherwise, just leave it off. Block linking, leave on. And then fast memory access rewrite, we're going to go ahead and leave this one off. It can give some performance boost, but on Xbox Series X and S should not be necessary and can break some things. Our next option, enable VRAM write texture replacement. Unfortunately, this isn't as useful an option as it sounds, as SwanStation and DuckStation don't really have very many texture replacement packs, as the feature has been lacking for some time. As a result, if you really want to mess with PS1 HD texture packs or texture replacements, you will need to get a PC and use Beetle PSX hardware, as there's no real good implementation of it on Xbox Series X and S at this time. Next, we have internal run ahead, so this will help you reduce input latency by running your games a couple frames ahead. So this is a very performance demanding option, so just experiment with it and see the results that you get. So 1 to 2 frames is usually always pretty good and gives a nice bonus to what you are doing. And for our last 3 options, we can basically just skip over them. And that's going to do it for our core options within SwanStation. So as always, if there's options you want to have set for some games but not others, head up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file, so that way they only apply to that one game and not the core as a whole. Now let's go ahead and talk about changing discs in your multi-disc titles. This is why you made those M3U files, to make this option very seamless. So this is the same regardless of which PlayStation core you're deciding to use. So here we have Chrono Cross Disc 2. I told it to do a new game and it's asking us to insert Disc 1. So to do this, go into your Retroarch quick menu, scroll down to Disc Control, press Eject Disc, and then the current disc index. If you press A on this, it'll show you the current discs that you can select. So let's just go ahead and change this over to Disc 1 for Chrono Cross, and now we'll tell it to insert the disc. And if for whatever reason that doesn't work the first time, chances are you may need to disable some UI options in Retroarch. So as you can see, it didn't work for me. So if we back out to Retroarch and go up to the settings page, user interface, turn off pause content when menu is active. Now going back into our quick menu, we could go back into the disc controls, eject the disc, make sure we have the proper disc selected, and then we could tell it to insert the disc. And it will load up as expected. And again, this is the same regardless of any PlayStation core you may be using. But there we go, we've now started a new game in Chrono Cross. Now, one last option I want to cover before we call this tutorial is the use of shaders. Retroarch shader library is very extensive and awesome, and there's so many cool things you could do with them, but heading into the shaders tab, you can enable them here, and make sure you have downloaded them from the online updater. But then just go to load, shader slang, and one of my favorites to use is CRT easy mode. It's just a really good CRT shader effect. There it is, I'm blind. And it looks pretty good on native resolution and upscaled content. But if you want to have the up-resed graphics, this is when that wonderful downsampling option comes into play here. So if we go back into the display options, go to downsampling, there we go. So we run that with CRT easy mode, and things are looking pretty dang awesome if I say, for my own personal desires here. But shaders are a personal preference deal, so just go through all of the multitude of them as you see fit, and once you find one you like, just go back into the shader tab, head down to save, and then you can save them as a core preset or a game preset depending on your tastes. And there you have it, PS1 emulation on the Xbox Series X and S using the 2 best cores available for it. As always, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope it helps you get your PS1 games up and running to your desires on the Xbox Series X and S. But here at the end, just the regular favors to ask. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit that thumbs up, thumbs down button, depending on how much you like today's tutorial, as well as that sub button and notification bell so you can see when all of our new videos go live, because we always have a ton coming your way, and I want you to be along for the ride. But if you'd like to further help support the channel and keep it going so you can see new videos like this, be sure to hit that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. A little really does go a long way to keeping this place up and running, and just a big shout out to all of our current champions that believe in what we do here and help us keep it going. You are amazing. Thank you again as always. But until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, keep on gaming, and we'll see you back next video.